Russia's frigid winds howled around the secret facility, carrying a bitter cold that sliced through even the thickest year. Captain America squinted against the icy flurries as he approached the facility's perimeter. From above, Iron Man hovered like a streak of burning red and gold against the bleak gray sky. They were both shrouded in silence, their focus absolute. "You remember the plan," Steve said firmly, his voice a controlled whisper over their coms. Iron Man, hovering just slightly lower, turned his head. "Relax, Capsicle. It's not exactly my first day on the job. Locate the bomb, save the townsfolk, go home. Easy." Tony's voice, as usual, carried that edge of sarcasm, light-hearted enough to sound dismissive, but heavy enough to make Steve bristle. Steve glanced back at the distant village lights scattered across the foothills. He knew better than to argue with Tony, but he couldn't let it go. People's lives are at stake. Stay sharp. Tony let out a soft scoff through his helmet. "Lives are always at stake, Cap. That's the job." Steve frowned but kept his thoughts to himself. He didn't like Tony's tone, too confident, too casual. This wasn't one of Tony's cocktail parties where words didn't matter. The facility's intel had been clear. There was an explosive device here, big enough to flatten a city, and a maniacal scientist at the controls. No room for ego, no room for error. "We stick to the plan," Steve said as they crouched in the shadow of a ridge. "I get in quietly. I find the scientist. You locate the bomb. We neutralize it. We get out. Simple." Tony's faceplate retracted just enough to give Steve a crooked smile. "Piece of cake. I'll make sure that oversized firecracker doesn't even tick." Steve sighed but gave Tony a small nod. "Good luck." "Don't need luck. I'm Tony Stark," he quipped as his faceplate slid back into place. Then, like a phantom, he lifted into the air and disappeared into the swirling snow. Steve shook his head, steeling himself for what was ahead. Tony's brilliance was undeniable, but his flippancy gnawed at Steve. Explosives this size weren't simple, and failure wasn't an option. With one final glance toward the frozen wilderness, Steve slipped into the shadows and infiltrated the facility. Steve moved like a ghost through the cold, industrial corridors of the facility. His shield was strapped tight to his back, the comforting weight a reminder of purpose. He kept low, ducking behind crates, avoiding patrols with the kind of precision that only came with years of experience. When soldiers did spot him, the fight was brutal but swift. Steve worked efficiently, his fists a blur of motion, his shield a precise weapon. He didn't have time for mercy. At last, he reached the lab. The door creaked open, revealing a nightmarish workshop of machinery and wires. Standing at its center, cackling over blinking monitors, was the mad scientist, a gaunt figure in a stained lab coat. "It's over," Steve growled, stepping into the room. The scientist turned, startled, but then grinned with sharp, yellowing teeth. "You're too late, Captain. My work is complete." "Where's the bomb?" Steve barked. The scientist sneered. "Tick. Tock." Steve lunged, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him into the console. The man shrieked, but it was no use. Within minutes, Steve had him unconscious, zip-tied to a chair. He looked around the lab frantically, but there was no bomb here. Just wires and decoys. Then Tony's voice crackled in his ear. Cap, we've got a problem." Steve stiffened. "What is it?" "Big glowing thing. Yup, definitely a bomb. And it's not listening to me." Steve's stomach dropped. "What do you mean it's not listening to you?" "I mean," Tony's voice sounded strained, frustrated. "It's not stopping. I can't defuse it. I'm coming to you." By the time Steve arrived at the bomb site, Tony was standing over the enormous device, his gauntlet glowing as he worked frantically against the bomb's interface. Steve took one look at Tony's face through the cracked glass of his helmet and felt a deep chill. Tony Stark looked afraid. "What's happening?" Steve demanded. "It's wired with redundancies. Whoever built this thing knew how to keep someone like me out. I'm good, Cap. But I'm not that good. There's got to be a way." "There isn't," Tony said harshly, his voice cracked, panic creeping in. We're out of time. We need to get out now. Steve stared at him, chest heaving. And the people outside? They'll die, Stark. I know, Tony snapped. But if we don't leave, we'll die, and no one will know to evacuate the towns. Go warn them, Cap. It's the only thing we can do. Reluctantly, Steve turned. He had no choice. The explosion shook the earth. Even miles away, it felt like thunder had broken the world. Smoke and fire billowed into the sky, blotting out the stars. Many lives were saved that night, but many were lost. Back in America, Steve felt the weight of those lives like chains around his chest. Days passed. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every face he'd seen in those villages haunted him. He replayed the moment in his mind over and over. There has to be a way, Stark. One night, as Steve walked the halls of the Avengers building, he stopped dead. Tony's voice drifted from a nearby room. You did what you had to, the artificial intelligence was saying. Statistically, you saved more lives. Taking the bomb into the air was too great a risk. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Tony muttered. They had a chance. We could've. I could've. Steve's stomach turned to ice as the AI continued. Sacrificing a few saved the many, sir. It was the most logical choice. Steve couldn't listen anymore. He turned and walked quickly to his room, slamming the door behind him. His hands shook as he leaned against the wall. Even one life, he thought. Even one chance. He couldn't let it go. When Steve found Tony the next day, the tension was palpable. We need to talk, Steve said. His voice was low, but sharp. Tony looked up from his work, expression hard. Oh, here we go. They could have survived, Tony. You didn't even try. Tony's jaw clenched. Don't you dare. I did try. I made the call, the one you couldn't make. You gave up. Steve snapped. You decided who lived and who died. Someone had to. Tony shouted, standing now. His voice was raw. Do you think I wanted this? I made the choice that saved the most people because I didn't have the luxury of pretending there was another way. Steve shook his head, his voice tight. No, we don't get to play God, Tony. Tony turned away, hands pressed against his desk. And we don't get to pretend we're heroes either. The silence between them was heavy, a chasm that neither man could cross. Captain America's anger was boiling beneath the surface. His jaw clenched tight as he stepped toward Iron Man, his boots echoing sharply against the sterile floors of the Avengers building. He put a firm hand on Tony's armored shoulder, spinning him halfway around. What is it, Steve? Tony asked, his voice flat, guarded. Captain America didn't answer immediately. For a long moment, the two stood face to face, eyes locked like titans on the brink of war. The tension in the room was palpable, as though the air itself braced for a fight that might shatter walls. Steve's hand fell back to his side, but he stayed close, glaring at Tony with an expression that could have melted steel. Then, without a word, he stepped back, his frustration etched in every line of his face, and walked out of the room. Tony didn't move. He stood there in the center of his lab, staring toward the doorway where Steve had disappeared. A part of him wanted to call out, but the words caught in his throat. He simply sighed and turned back to his work, though his hands trembled slightly when they met the cold surface of his desk. Things were never the same after that. The Avengers could sense it even if they didn't say it out loud. Captain America and Iron Man had changed. They stopped working together on missions, choosing to take separate assignments. During briefings, they avoided making eye contact. The air around them always felt heavy, like a storm cloud following them everywhere they went. It was as though a crack had formed, a rift that couldn't be ignored, and neither man knew how to fix it. Steve didn't blame Tony entirely for what happened in Russia, but he couldn't understand him either. To Steve, the smallest chance to save a life mattered. To Tony, numbers and odds dictated the way forward, logic and sacrifice. They were both right, in their own ways, but that didn't make the division between them any less painful. Days turned into weeks. One evening, the Avengers were called out for an emergency mission, all except for Steve and Tony, who had both stayed behind for routine security rotations. The building was almost unnervingly quiet. For hours, Steve tried to focus on paperwork in his quarters, but the silence kept dragging his thoughts back to Tony. It gnawed at him. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, he stood up, grabbed his shield, and marched towards Stark's quarters. Tony was seated in the middle of his room, slumped in his chair with his armor still on. The hum of the arc reactor was the only sound. "Why didn't you tell me, Tony?" Steve asked sharply as he stepped into the room. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the weight of accusation behind it. Tony looked up slowly. "Tell you what?" "That," Steve barked, gesturing toward the lab as though the ghost of their last mission still lingered there. "That you were willing to sacrifice those people. That you didn't even try. You made that call without me, Stark." Tony straightened in his chair, an edge to his voice now. "I did try, Steve, but there wasn't time. The bomb was primed, and I made the best call I could in the moment. You would have done the same thing." "Don't put words in my mouth," Steve snapped. He was closer now, the tension escalating by the second. "If there was even a 1% chance, we owed it to those people to try. Every single one of them." Tony pushed himself out of the chair, the servos in his armor whining softly as he stood. "And if we failed?" He shot back. "If that bomb had gone off with all of us inside, what then? You think your ideals would have saved anyone? Sometimes we don't get the luxury of heroics, Cap. We make choices, and they're ugly. But someone's got to make them." Steve's eyes flared with anger, his patience finally snapping. Before he knew it, his hand shot forward, grabbing Tony's armored shoulder again, only this time it was rougher, more deliberate. "Don't do this, Steve," Tony warned in a low voice. Steve didn't answer. He was staring Tony down, eyes unblinking. The room felt like it might crack under the pressure. And then, just as suddenly as the silence had come, it shattered. Steve stepped back and slapped Tony across the faceplate of his helmet. The sound rang through the room like thunder. For a moment, everything stopped. Then Tony lunged. The first punch came fast, his gauntlet landing against Steve's shield with a clang that echoed through the building. Steve staggered back, raising his shield instinctively to defend against the next blow. "You don't get to judge me, Steve," Tony shouted, his voice vibrating with fury. "You weren't the one in my suit, staring at that countdown. You left them." Steve roared back, meeting each of Tony's strikes with the sharp ring of vibranium. The fight was brutal, a storm of fists, gauntlets, and shield strikes. Sparks flew as Tony's repulsors slammed into the shield, the force nearly knocking Steve off his feet. Steve rolled to the side and swung the shield like a battering ram, catching Tony in the chest and sending him stumbling back. The alarm screamed through the Avengers building, blaring red lights as if the building itself were trying to break up the fight. Neither man cared. Tony, breathing heavily, tried to focus his HUD to land another strike, but Steve saw the opening. He stepped in with a crushing punch, knocking Tony off balance and slamming him hard into the floor. For a moment, all that could be heard was the whine of Tony's armor trying to recalibrate. "Enough, Tony!" Steve shouted, his voice ragged with emotion. Tony groaned, lying on his back, the glow of his arc reactor flickering slightly. "You can't always save everyone, Steve," he muttered hoarsely. "You think you can, but you can't. You can't." Steve froze. His breathing was heavy, the shield trembling in his hand. He looked down at Tony for a long moment, then turned sharply on his heel and stormed out of the room. The alarms fell silent. Tony sat up slowly, pressing a hand against the flickering arc reactor in his chest. The room was a mess, glass shattered, walls dented, wires sparking. He sat there on the cold floor, staring at the doorway where Steve had vanished, the weight of the fight heavy on his shoulders. Captain America didn't stop walking until he reached the building's exit. Outside, the night was dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos inside. He stood for a moment under the stars, breathing hard, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Then he walked into the shadows and disappeared. In his room, Tony Stark sat alone, still kneeling on the ground, a man surrounded by broken glass and silence.